They told us the ocean was empty, that its silence meant safety, that the darkness below was lifeless. But they were wrong. Something waits down there, older than time, deeper than death. It doesn't roar or chase. It whispers, and it watches. We wrote rules to survive it. We broke them. I was a government rescue diver once. Now I'm something else. If you're hearing this, it may already be too late. I never feared the deep. That in itself set me apart long before I understood what it meant. For most, the ocean is a place of beauty and danger, a vast expanse to admire from the safety of the shore. But for me, it was a calling, a hunger. As a child, I would sit for hours by the tide pools near Puget Sound, staring into their blackness, wondering what lay beyond the reach of sunlight. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, primal. I didn't want to explore the sea. I wanted to belong to it. When I joined the Navy, I already knew I would volunteer for the Special Operations Diving Program. Others hesitated, flinched, at the idea of descending into total darkness with nothing but a rebreather and a dive knife between them and oblivion. But I felt most alive in those moments, when the world narrowed to pressure and pulse, when gravity lost its grip, and all that remained was breath and descent. They called me fearless, but it wasn't fearlessness. It was familiarity. The dark welcomed me. It felt like returning. I rose quickly through the ranks, passed the psych evaluations, aced the pressure tolerance tests, scored high on every dive simulation. My instructors noted my unnatural calm. One of them joked that I had gills hidden somewhere. I laughed with them. But the truth is, it didn't feel like training. It felt like remembering. Everything changed in the Mariana Trench. It was supposed to be a deep dive reconnaissance mission. Classified coordinates, civilian sensor anomaly, minimal risk. We descended in a 3-man submersible tethered to a support vessel far above. The others were seasoned divers, Lieutenant Henson and Petty Officer Reyes, solid men, smart. We didn't talk much once the darkness swallowed us. There's an unspoken reverence in the deep, a silence that feels sacred. At 35,000 feet, the lights began to fail. Not all at once, just one by one, in patterns that didn't make sense. Then came the pressure fluctuations. I remember Reyes calling out numbers, ambient pressure dropping then spiking, but his voice was thin, distant, like it was coming through water rather than comms. Henson reached for manual override. That was the last thing I saw before the viewing port was eclipsed by something massive. Not a creature, not an object, just movement, deliberate, a ripple through the dark that bent the sub around us like it was made of foil. I should have died. We all should have. But I woke up floating, suit ruptured, oxygen nearly gone. Rescue teams found me 18 hours later drifting at the edge of the trench, unconscious but alive. The official report cited equipment failure, an undetected current, surge pilot error. The Navy called it a tragedy. I knew better. There was something down there. It didn't kill me. It let me go. At the time, I didn't ask why. But the dream started 3 weeks later, and I realized you don't return from the abyss untouched. You either leave something behind or bring something back with you. After the Mariana Trench, life above sea level felt artificial. I moved through the world like a ghost in someone else's skin, smiling when I was supposed to, nodding at the right moments, but always with one eye on the ocean. The Navy discharged me on medical grounds. Acute psychological distress, the file read, survivor's guilt, possible neurological damage due to decompression trauma. They offered me medication, therapy, and a quiet retirement. I took the pills, attended the sessions, but none of it reached the part of me that had been altered. None of it touched the truth. The nightmares came first. In them I was always sinking, slow, steady, helpless. The water was ink, thick and sentient. My limbs wouldn't respond. I wasn't drowning. I was being studied, watched. Something massive waited just beyond the range of light, patient as stone, as if it had all the time in the world. I would wake up with my heart pounding, sweat-soaked, the taste of salt on my lips. Sometimes I'd wake gasping, convinced I was still down there miles beneath the surface. Other times it was worse. I'd wake up calm, content, missing the quiet of the deep. The doctors said it was textbook PTSD, but PTSD didn't explain the changes. I started, holding my breath without realizing it, 3 minutes, 4, once almost 7. My vision sharpened at night. In darkness I saw depth, gradients, flickers of movement no one else noticed, and when I cut myself slicing an apple one afternoon, I watched the blood bead up in my palm, darker than it should have been, moving, with a coherence that felt unnatural. I told myself it was paranoia, residual stress, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back, or worse, awakened inside me. I moved to a coastal town in Washington State, somewhere, with a view of the ocean. I thought maybe the proximity would help settle the ache, the phantom pull I felt at all hours. It didn't. I spent hours just staring at the waves, not looking for anything in particular, just waiting, like I was supposed to return to something. I'd forgotten. 6 months after the Mariana incident, the knock came. Precise, 3 raps, like a metronome. I checked my watch, 3:17 p.m. Thursday. I remember that because I'd been counting minutes again. A woman stepped inside without waiting, for permission. White hair pulled so tight it looked painful, blue eyes like glacial ice. She placed a file on my coffee table. "Lieutenant Jackson Thompson," she said. It wasn't a question. "Your country needs you again." "I don't dive anymore," I replied. "Not since Mariana." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "That's exactly why we're interested. That's how I met Director Lawson. And that's when I learned the government hadn't written me off as broken. They'd been watching, studying, because something in me had changed, and they weren't afraid of it. They were curious. 3 days after Director Lawson's visit, I found myself aboard a military transport helicopter, roaring above the churning waters of the North Pacific. No insignias marked the aircraft. No name tags identified the crew. Everything about the operation was sterilized, anonymous, intentionally detached from any formal branch of the military I had ever known. We flew for hours, into weather that seemed eager to strip the skin off the world, until finally a shape emerged through the mist. A massive oil platform, long since gutted and rebuilt into something else. They called it Station 7. As we descended, onto the landing pad, I immediately noticed how wrong the place felt. It wasn't just the absence of markings or the grey utilitarian construction. It was in the way the structure breathed, a subtle hum in the floor panels, a pulsing rhythm I could feel through my boots. I'd spent enough time around industrial engineering to know when a platform was alive with activity, but this was something different, something deeper. A man in a slate-grey uniform greeted me at the edge of the helipad. He didn't offer a name, only a nod and a sharp turn, expecting me to follow. His shoulder bore a colored tab, yellow, and I would later learn that these tabs were the only identifiers used among the personnel here. No names, no ranks, just colors. Yellow meant security, blue for science, orange for engineering, green for command. I was assigned no color, not yet. We descended metal stairs that clanged with every step, past sealed corridors and reinforced doors. As we walked, I noticed something else. No one was speaking. The people we passed averted their eyes or glanced with barely veiled pity. A few murmured as we passed, "Fresh meat, poor bastard." But mostly they just moved with mechanical efficiency, as though rehearsing steps they had taken countless times, too exhausted or afraid to change them. Inside, the platform's layout was maze-like, purposefully disorienting. The hallways sloped at subtle angles, too subtle to be accidental, and many corridors had no clear labeling. We passed thick observation windows showing the sea below, but the water pressed so dark and dense against the glass that it might as well have been outer space. The pressure, even here above the surface, was psychological. Eventually we arrived at what my escort called the command core, a vast central chamber lined with flickering monitors, data towers, and a holographic projection of the ocean floor. Red pulses marked the screen. Anomalous zones, I was told. Active sites, thin places, tears in the fabric between our world and something else. That's when I realized this wasn't just another deep-sea research base. It wasn't even military. This was something older than both. Something carved out of black budgets and whispers. Whatever they were doing here, it wasn't sanctioned in any conventional sense. It was hidden for a reason. A woman in an orange-tabbed uniform approached me with a twitchy energy, her eyes dark and unblinking. "Ortiz," she introduced herself, tapping a rhythm on a handheld diagnostic tool. "Engineering." Her fingers never stopped moving even as she spoke. "You'll get used to the hum. Took me 2 weeks." "What hum?" I asked. She stopped tapping just for a second. "The one that isn't coming from the machines." Before, I could press her. An alert tone echoed through the facility. Not a warning, but a signal. Everyone turned in unison toward the glass viewport on the far side of the chamber, and that was the first time I saw the Orpheus. The Orpheus surfaced like something exhaled by the abyss, an enormous submarine breaching the docking bay with a grace that belied its bulk. It wasn't shaped like any vessel I'd seen in the Navy. Its hull was a deep, matte black, oddly textured, with smooth bulges and jointed plates that shifted ever so slightly as it moved. Where windows should have been, there were thickened domes layered with material I couldn't identify, like glass crossbred with something organic. Pipes ran along its surface like veins. The thing didn't look engineered. It looked grown. Ortiz stood beside me, her eyes fixed on it with something that bordered on affection. "Pressure adaptive alloy," she murmured. "It changes with depth, learns almost. She's not just a sub, she's a prototype, a compromise." A compromise. "Between what?" I asked. Her fingers twitched again, resuming their restless dance. "Between what we are and what we need to be to survive down there." The docking procedure was disturbingly smooth. The water in the chamber drained in stages, the floor rising on a hydraulic platform to meet the ship's hatch. When it opened, the first figures stepped out, fully suited in dive gear unlike anything I'd ever seen. Thick, reinforced, yet somehow lighter in build. The helmets were oversized, with panoramic visors and built-in sensor arrays. Their surfaces shimmered faintly, as if adjusting to the lighting. One figure emerged last, larger than the rest, moving with a confidence that made everyone else pause. When he removed his helmet, I saw a man weathered by years, with a deep scar, running from his temple to his jawline and eyes that didn't blink nearly as often as they should. But it wasn't the scar that held my attention. It was his skin. Even under the harsh white lights of the docking bay, there was a faint bluish cast to it, subtle but unmistakable. "Captain Rhodes," Ortiz said with an unmistakable note of respect. "He's been with the division longer than anyone. 22 years in the deep." Rhodes turned and his eyes met mine. I don't know how to describe it. There was no recognition. We'd never met, but something in his gaze weighed me, measured me, like a diver checking the integrity of his gear before a plunge. He gave the smallest nod before turning away to debrief his crew, leaving me standing there like an uninvited guest at a wake. Later that evening, my official orientation began in a heavily reinforced room 3 levels below the surface deck. Rhodes was the one conducting it. His voice was gravel worn smooth, like he'd spoken to pressure more than people. The lights in the room were low, and a thick manual sat on the desk between us, bound in leather that felt too smooth, too warm almost. Alive? I'll be direct, he said. Half the people who come through this program don't survive their first year. A quarter of those who do stop being themselves. Define stop being themselves, I said. You'll know it if it happens to you, he replied. This work comes with costs. Physical, psychological, existential. You'll want to believe that the rules we give you are excessive, even paranoid. But every rule was written after someone broke it, and every one of them was written in blood. Slid the manual toward me. Embossed across the front were the words Operational Protocols, Abyssal Environments. Inside, the first pages covered the expected gas mixtures, pressure transition charts, emergency decompression steps, but that ended abruptly by page 6. Page 7 began with a bold warning. These rules are non-negotiable. Deviation ensures termination. 7 rules, each more surreal than the last. Maintain a precise distance from your dive partner. 6 feet, not 7, not 5. Reflections. That don't match your movements. Terminate immediately. Voices without visual confirmation, ignore them. Tunnels in the seafloor. Luminous surfaces, written material. Each came with its own silent curse. Rule 7 was the final line. If you begin to enjoy the darkness, you've already been compromised. I looked up from the manual. Rhodes hadn't moved. His expression was unreadable, but his left hand rested on the edge of the table, tight, white-knuckled. These rules, he said, are the only reason any of us are still here. For the first time since Mariana, I felt something colder than the water that had nearly killed me. It was the realization that I hadn't been saved, I'd been marked. The manual felt wrong the moment my fingers touched it. It was heavier than it looked, bound in a dark, supple material that seemed to retain heat unnaturally, like it had been resting on a radiator rather than a steel table in a cold, climate-controlled room 3 decks beneath the ocean. The surface texture was too smooth, too uniform, like skin grown in a lab. I didn't ask what it was made of. I didn't want the answer. The words, Operational Protocols, Abyssal Environments were embossed across the cover in a font that looked vaguely military, but just off enough to unsettle me. Sharp angles, aggressive lines, like the letters had been carved rather than printed. Rhodes didn't say anything as I flipped the cover open, but I could feel his eyes on me, measuring my every breath, every flicker of hesitation. The first few pages were standard enough, textbook diving procedure, but presented with extreme specificity. Exact ratios for mixed gas rebreathers depending on depth and duration. Unusually strict ascent protocols. A section on pressure acclimation that referenced neurological responses I'd never seen included in any military documentation. It was dense, precise, obsessive, but then halfway through the 6th page, the language changed. The clinical tone gave way to something colder, less procedural, more ritualistic. The paper stock even changed texture, thicker with faint watermarking I couldn't decipher. That's when I reached page 7. A warning spanned the top of the page in bold, red-stamped letters. These rules are written in experience and sealed in sacrifice. Deviation ensures termination. Beneath it began the first of the 7 primary rules. They were short to the point, each followed by a small block of text, less explanation than justification. There were no footnotes, no references to supporting documentation, just cause and effect. If you break the rule, you don't come back. It wasn't a manual anymore. It was a ledger of the dead. I closed the book slowly, the leather creaking softly in my hands. Across from me, Rhodes finally spoke. "You've seen what the deep can do, Thompson. That means you're already ahead of most. But out here, knowledge doesn't save you, obedience does. He stood up, gaze steady. Memorize the rules, internalize them. Because when things start to go wrong, and they will, you won't have time to read. Rhodus didn't lecture, he recited. Each rule came from his mouth with the slow certainty of a man who had said them hundreds of times, not like doctrine, but like last words carved into stone. I sat there as he listed them one by one, his voice steady, never rising, never falling. The silence between each rule was longer than it needed to be, like space was being held for the dead they represented. Rule 1. Maintain a 6-foot distance from your dive partner at all times. No exceptions. 7 feet is too far. You can't reach them if something goes wrong, he said. And 5 feet is too close. You won't know if what you're seeing is them or something pretending to be. I must have frowned because he added without prompting, "Mimicry isn't theoretical, Thompson. We've recovered footage, reflections that move a second too late. Suits that look perfect until they speak without moving their mouths. 6 feet is the safety margin. We figured that out empirically, lost 2 divers learning it. Rule 2. If your reflection in any surface does not match your movement, terminate the dive immediately. Glass, steel, helmet visors, even calm water. Any reflective surface," he said. "If the image hesitates, if it's too fast or too slow, abort. No hesitation, no salvage, get out." I opened my mouth, but he cut me off. "Don't ask what happens if you don't. Just don't. We only found pieces of Alvarez. Rule 3. Do not respond to voices unless you have visual confirmation of their source. This one's harder than you think," he said. "Underwater, voices carry weird, especially human voices. You'll hear someone whispering your name. Sometimes. It sounds like a teammate. Sometimes someone you've lost. Ignore it. Every time someone answers, we lose them." His eyes lingered on mine a second longer than necessary. "It doesn't mean they die. It means we don't find them." Rule 4. If you encounter a vertical tunnel extending below the seafloor, do not look down it. Just don't. He said it so firmly I felt a chill. "Turn around, ascend. If your curiosity gets the better of you, you won't be the one coming back up." He exhaled slowly, as if remembering something. Turner ignored that rule. Wanted to get a sample. We found his helmet stuck in a stone lattice. Nothing inside it, nothing around it, just silence. Rule 5. Do not touch surfaces that emit light or sound without explicit authorization. Some structures hum, some glow, some pulse. They're beautiful. They're designed to be. But they're not inert. I remembered what Ortiz had said. The ship learns, it adapts. But this sounded less like technology and more like biology. Like the ruins themselves were alive. Fisher broke this rule, Rhodes said, his voice a little lower. We watched his hand stretch toward a glowing panel like it wasn't even his anymore. The suit recorded his vitals spiking, then changing. When we pulled him back, he wasn't completely human. Rule 6. Never remove written material from compromised sites. I blinked. Written material. Notes. Symbols. Etchings, carvings, books. Doesn't matter the format, he replied. If it was found in an active site, it stays there. Do not record it, do not translate it, do not take it. He leaned forward slightly, as if wanting to burn the message deeper into me. There's something encoded in the language. It affects the reader, sometimes slowly, sometimes instantly. I felt a pang of skepticism, but I kept it to myself. Rhodez noticed anyway. We lost an entire team because one researcher thought it was safe to sketch a mural. By the time we realized what he'd done, they were all gone. Not dead. Gone. Rule 7. If you begin to enjoy the darkness, you've already been compromised. This one chilled me more than the others because it didn't sound like a precaution. It sounded like a diagnosis. You'll know when it happens, Rhodus said. You'll feel calm where you shouldn't. Safe when your brain tells you to run. The pressure will feel like comfort. The silence will sound like song. He tapped the manual once with a calloused finger. It won't feel like fear anymore, it'll feel like home. He stood then without ceremony and adjusted his shoulder harness as if the conversation had already ended. These 7 are the non-negotiables, he said. The rest of the manual, gas mixes, timings, decompression procedures, those will keep your body alive. But these, he met my eyes one last time, these are the only things that will keep your mind yours. He walked out without waiting for my response. I sat in the silence he left behind, the rules heavy in my hands. They didn't read like warnings, they read like confessions. 3 days later, I stood in the observation deck above the dive chamber, watching as the crew prepared for descent. The atmosphere aboard the Orpheus was heavy, not just with pressure, but with tension, the kind that doesn't come from fear, but from repetition. Everyone moved with mechanical precision. Checklists were silent, gestures practiced. There were no jokes, no banter. Even the technicians communicated mostly through nods and eye flicks. It was less like a team prepping for a dive, and more like a group of monks performing a sacred rite. Captain Rhodus had made it clear, I was there to observe, nothing more. No water time until we know how the deep responds to you, he'd said, or how you respond to it. I hadn't argued. I didn't want to. The dive team was small. 2 divers, Dr. Nakamura leading the survey and Davis, a stocky ex-Navy diver with eyes that looked 10 years older than his face. He was quiet, methodical, and moved like someone who had almost died more than once. Watching him prep his gear was like watching a ritual, every clip, every strap checked and rechecked in exact order. He didn't smile, didn't speak unless necessary. When Nakamura adjusted her exoskeletal spine brace, Davis nodded once, then checked her air mixture without being asked. No wasted motion, no trust unearned. As I stood behind the reinforced glass, a faint tremor passed through the deck as the chamber began to flood. The divers stepped in, their suits already sealed. These weren't standard Navy suits. They were sleek, pressure reactive, equipped with neural feedback systems and internal monitoring arrays that fed directly into the Orpheus's core. The helmets alone looked like something designed for space exploration. Wider fields of view, enhanced optical sensors, built-in response suppression systems. If something went wrong out there, the suit could override panic responses, could shut down motor function, could drag the wearer back up against their will. I tried not to think about how many times that had probably happened. Maintain full visual during descent, Rhodus said from beside me, voice flat. If either of them deviates from protocol, you notify me immediately. You remember the rules. I nodded. I remembered them too well. The chamber finished flooding, and the outer hatch opened. Water surged outward into the black void. No light penetrated beyond the initial 10 feet, just particulate drift, like snow in a dead sky. The divers dropped slowly, their tethers extending from the ceiling, lights cutting clean cones into the darkness. Nakamura went first, calm and composed. Davis followed behind, maintaining exact formation. First dive with ARD, he had asked me earlier in the prep room, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. Then remember Rule 1, 6 feet, no matter what. It saved my life, 3 times. He didn't elaborate, just finished checking his pressure seals and walked away. Now from above, I could see them begin their descent toward the anomaly site, a point under the Arctic shelf where sonar had picked up unnatural geometries at nearly 900 feet. There shouldn't have been anything down there. No ruins, no man-made structures, but the scans told a different story. Their lights flickered briefly as they passed a thermocline, and I felt my breath catch. From here on, They were beyond rescue, range, and ahead of them something impossible was waiting to be found. The structure emerged from the dark like a dream someone had tried to forget. First, just edges, hard lines where none should exist, angles too precise to be natural. Then the mass of it, a temple-like formation carved into the seafloor but somehow inverted, its base pointing skyward, as though the entire complex had been built in defiance of gravity. Massive stone blocks interlocked seamlessly, their surfaces worn yet intact, untouched by erosion or growth. Nakamura and Davis floated in silence, their helmet cameras transmitting a clear feed to my station. Even through the reinforced monitors, I could feel the wrongness of what I was seeing. The structure wasn't just ancient, it was alien, not in origin but in logic. It didn't obey our rules of architecture or stress tolerance. Archways held impossible weight. Supporting beams curved backward into themselves. There were stairs, but they led upward into nothing, and doorways without rooms behind them. The layout wasn't designed to accommodate movement. It seemed to exist for observation, watching, waiting. The more I stared, the more the image shifted. Not literally, not like the camera was moving, but like the structure was resisting being perceived. Some sections seemed to phase into one another, overlapping geometries that didn't align with their physical placement. A wall became a corner, a floor folded into a ceiling. The further the divers moved, the more the distortion grew, and I had the sensation that the ruin wasn't truly submerged. It was anchored in some other orientation, partially submerged in our reality, partially in something else. Then I noticed the fish. At first glance they appeared normal, small bioluminescent creatures weaving between the monoliths. But then I realized they weren't just drifting. They were moving with deliberate purpose in tight, synchronized formations. And worse, they were swimming backwards, not tumbling as if caught in a current, but tail first, heads leading. Like rewound footage, but happening in real time. They passed within inches of Nakamura's shoulder. Her sensors registered no contact. The ruin responded, or perhaps noticed. A low vibration began to hum through the feed, not picked up by audio but visible in the light. Dust lifted from the seafloor in spirals. The divers paused, and then, from Davis's channel, came a sound I didn't expect. He was counting. 10. 9, 8. His voice was monotone, hollow, lacking urgency, emotion, or context. 7. I leaned in toward the console, heart starting to pound. 6. 5. His movements grew jerky, delayed, like his body no longer belonged to him, and in that moment I knew something had gone very, very wrong. 4. 3. Davis's voice continued over the comms, detached and steady, each number falling like a stone into deep water. On screen, his body twisted mid-water, limbs misaligned with intention, movements erratic, like a puppet caught between conflicting commands. Nakamura immediately turned toward him, closing the distance. I heard myself whisper no, before I realized what was happening. 6 feet. She was breaking Rule 1. But she didn't hesitate. "Davis, respond!" she called out, her voice sharper than usual. He didn't answer. His fingers were moving toward his oxygen regulator, not fumbling, but with mechanical purpose. I slammed the override beacon, signaling emergency extraction protocol. "He's about to compromise his gear," I said into the comm. Captain Rhodus was already at my side, watching the feed with jaw clenched. "Get her out, both of them." 2. 1. Nakamura reached Davis just as his fingers curled around the regulator latch. She grabbed his wrists, forcing them away from his chest. The resistance was immediate. He thrashed, pushing against her grip, but she held fast, anchoring them both with her boots against a protruding ledge on the ruin. The struggle wasn't violent. It was methodical, like he was executing a set of instructions that she was trying to interrupt. His helmet cam feed showed his face behind the visor, blank eyes, unfocused, staring into something none of us could see. The chamber flooded with static as interference from the structure grew. Communications sputtered, then spiked. I heard overlapping voices for a moment, whispers layered in languages I couldn't pass. Symbols flickered across Davis's telemetry stream, unreadable glyphs flashing and vanishing in milliseconds. Then the feed stabilized. Nakamura had managed to drag him back to the designated extraction zone, guiding his rigid frame with precise, practiced movements. The Orpheus's retrieval arms extended, clamping around them like steel claws. The system hissed, groaned, and lifted them into the airlock chamber. As the chamber sealed, I saw Davis's body go limp. Rhythmic pulses echoed through the control bay as the flood chamber drained. I turned to Rhodes, waiting for some reassurance, some explanation, but he didn't speak. He only stared at the monitor's eyes narrowed. "She broke protocol," I said. "She saved his life," he replied after a long silence. "But something touched him, and we'll need to find out what." The medical bay aboard the Orpheus smelled like antiseptic and cold metal, the kind of place where answers were expected, but silence was more common. Davis lay motionless on the diagnostic table, chest rising and falling with the rhythm of assisted ventilation. Electrodes mapped his vitals, lines tracked neural impulses. The data showed stability, normal even, but his eyes, when they finally opened, held the kind of vacancy you don't recover from. "I was collecting samples," he said after 10 long minutes of observation. "Then I woke up here. Dr. Keller, the chief medical officer, didn't speak. She just adjusted the light, watching his pupils." "You don't remember anything between?" I asked from my position in the doorway. Davis blinked slowly. "Between what?" Rhodes stood to my left, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He gave a small nod to the technician, who pulled up the audio logs from Davis's suit. The playback echoed through the room. 10, 9, 8. Davis's own voice filled the space, disembodied and sterile. As the countdown continued, I saw the blood drain from his face. "That's not possible," he whispered. I wouldn't." "We've seen this before," Keller said quietly. "Loss of memory, dissociation, complete behavioral override, but never this early into exposure." "He followed Rule 1, I muttered, though I wasn't sure if it was meant as reassurance or irony. Rhodes didn't speak. He was watching. Nakamura, who stood near the far wall, hands clasped behind her back, calm in a way that felt unnatural. She wasn't observing Davis. She was watching me, and in her hands was a small containment case, black, cube-shaped, sealed with reinforced clamps and lined with internal damping foam. Inside it sat an object I recognized from the dive footage, a perfect obsidian cube pulled from the ruin. No inscriptions, no markings, just polished matte black, absorbing every light in the room. It reflected nothing, not the bulbs overhead, not the faint red glow of the monitor arrays. It was like a hole in reality, dense and still. "You brought that back," I said. Nakamura finally looked at me. "We need to study it," she replied, as though that answered everything. "After what it did to Davis," she tilted her head, slightly. "Did it do anything, or did it reveal something that was already there?" Rhodes stepped forward. "Containment protocols. Full isolation." Nakamura nodded and left the room, the cube case cradled in her arms like a child. But before she stepped out, she gave me one last look, subtle, unreadable, and laced with something I didn't yet understand. Expectation. 2 days after the dive, I was summoned to the lower research lab. Not with orders, no briefing, no chain of command urgency. Just a message scrawled in pen on a folded slip of paper outside my quarters. "Come now," quietly. It wasn't signed, but I knew who had written it. The lab door opened with a hiss, sealing behind me with a sound that felt far too final. Dr. Nakamura stood near the center of the chamber, her back to me, facing a thick containment cylinder filled with seawater under extreme pressure. Inside, suspended in the artificial current, was the obsidian cube. It hadn't changed, but the room around it had. The lights were dimmer. The air had weight. Even the hum of the equipment felt slower, as though time itself strained to move near the thing. She didn't turn to greet me. "Watch carefully," she said instead. Her fingers danced across a nearby terminal, triggering a bank of scanners aimed at the containment chamber. Spectral arrays, laser interferometers, magnetic field monitors, all standard instruments for studying exotic materials, but none of them recorded anything usual. No heat, no energy signature, no reflection or refraction, only absence. She activated a low-intensity UV emitter, and the cube vanished entirely from view, swallowed the light without any trace. "It absorbs everything," Nakamura said, finally turning toward me. "All spectra, all frequencies. It's not inert matter, it's responsive, selective." "Then why isn't it doing anything now?" I asked. Her gaze held steady. "Because it's observing, learning, reacting only when something of interest is near." She stepped aside and waved a hand over a nearby microscope connected to a sample tray. A digital display bloomed above it, magnified blood samples. "Mine. You've been changing," she said without preamble. Quietly but unmistakably, I stared at the screen. The cells weren't moving randomly. They pulsed in rhythmic, repeating formations, aligning, separating, reforming in fractal spirals. They looked alive in a way that went beyond biology. They looked aware. "You didn't notice it?" she asked. "I noticed," I admitted. "I thought I was imagining it." She shook her head. "The deep alters us. That's not theory anymore. It's observation. You've been adapting ever since the Mariana incident. The dive just accelerated it." I swallowed. "What kind of adaptation?" "Increased oxygen retention, visual acuity in low light, neural plasticity. But more than that, your cells respond to proximity, to pressure, to the cube." "And what does that mean?" I asked. She stepped closer. "It means you're more like the environment down there than you are like anyone up here." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The implications sat in my throat like seawater. "We've seen this before," she added softly. "But never this." Fast, then she smiled. Calm, clinical, certain. "You're becoming something designed to survive the deep." Nakamura pulled a worn file from a locked drawer beneath the lab bench, its surface creased and softened by time. The kind of manila folder you'd expect to find in a basement archive, not in a classified facility 100 miles offshore. She laid it flat on the table and opened it with care, as though what it contained could bite. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Glossy prints, black and white at first, then color, aging with each turn of the page. Each photo showed a person, men and women of various backgrounds, standing beside submarines, posing in wetsuits, seated in dim-lit debriefing rooms, their faces caught in mid-thought, mid-transformation. Some smiled. Most didn't. Many of the photos bore stamps in red ink, terminated, contained, unstable. "These are the others," she said, not needing to elaborate. "Individuals who survived deep contact events, some documented, others buried." I flipped through them slowly. A man in 1974 with webbing between his fingers, grinning like he didn't know it was there. A woman in 1989, her eyes reflecting light like a cat's. One image showed a diver mid-examination, his blood suspended under magnification, curling into perfect circles, just like mine. A few bore handwritten annotations, notes on lung capacity, neural activity spikes, altered stress responses. Only a handful had no red stamps. Only 2 were marked active. One of them was Captain Rhodes. The last photo stopped me cold. It was grainy, slightly out of focus, taken at what looked like a hospital bedside. A younger version of me lay unconscious, tubes snaking from my arms, salt crusted around my mouth. Mariana recovery, Nakamura confirmed. You were the 8th candidate we've identified. Your profile is different, accelerated. You're responding to exposure in ways we didn't think were possible. I looked up from the folder. What happened to the others? She didn't answer right away. Just closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer. Some couldn't handle the changes, she said. They fought it. Others embraced it, too fully. And those are the ones we had to put down. I didn't ask which path they thought I was on, but as I left the lab, the reflection in the glass hatch blinked half a second before I did. And I wasn't sure anymore which version of me had moved first. The emergency alarm sounded just after midnight. Not the cold mechanical tone of a systems alert, but the triple blast wail reserved for deployment-level incidents. I was already awake when it started, sitting at the edge of my bunk, staring into the darkness like I expected it to speak back. Within minutes, the Orpheus roared to life, systems booting, crew rushing down corridors like blood through veins. I moved without needing instruction. My suit waited in the dive bay. The air had that low-frequency hum again, barely audible but vibrating in the chest. A sound you felt more than heard. The briefing was short and taut. Station Depth 7, a remote research site built to study thermal vent anomalies near the North Pacific Trench, had gone dark. Last transmissions reported pressure inconsistencies and structural irregularities before comms ceased entirely. 12 researchers unaccounted for. The mission, extraction and data recovery. Lawson's voice echoed through the command bay. Primary objective is personnel. Secondary, research logs. Do not engage or tamper with anomalous artifacts unless authorized, but her eyes said otherwise. There was something down there she wanted. Captain Rhodes led the team. Ortiz manned engineering. Nakamura handled scientific operations. I was assigned as auxiliary support, an extra body in case things went sideways. And deep down, I knew. This wasn't about testing equipment or recovering staff. This was about seeing what I could endure. The Orpheus launched through turbulent waters, descending rapidly. As we dropped, the temperature plummeted, and the view outside our cameras shifted, from silt-gray drift to absolute black. The sea here felt heavier, thicker. Ortiz muttered from her console, "This water's wrong, too dense, like we're pushing through syrup." The deeper we went, the more the hull groaned, the adaptive plating flexing like muscle. At 3,000 feet, the external lights barely reached a few meters out. Shadows clung to the glass. And still we went deeper. At 4,700 feet, we saw the station. From one side, it looked intact, lights flickering, structure stable. But as we circled, the illusion collapsed. A section of the facility had fused with the surrounding bedrock, like it had been pulled halfway into stone. Steel twisted into basalt, walls bending at impossible angles, windows frozen mid-frame like they'd been caught during a blink. It was as if the station hadn't just been crushed, it had been reconfigured. "I've seen this before," Rhodes muttered under his breath, voice barely audible, then louder. "Prepare your gear, we're going in." The airlock hissed open like a sigh from something ancient and wounded. Inside, the station was dim, lit only by emergency strips that pulsed. At irregular intervals, too slow to be helpful, too synchronized to be accidental. The air was breathable barely, but tasted metallic, sharp at the back of the throat like blood in water. Our boots rang too loudly on the floor. Every sound echoed wrong, too long in some places, clipped short in others, like the walls couldn't agree on their own geometry. As we pushed deeper into the main corridor, the distortion began. At first it was subtle. A bulkhead shifted a few degrees off-center. A hallway bent slightly upward without rising. Then it worsened. We passed through the same intersection, twice without turning. A stairwell that should have gone down curved sideways into a hallway we hadn't entered. Rooms connected to themselves. Doorways led to blank walls, and blank walls opened into rooms that hadn't existed seconds earlier. I checked my position on the schematic. It didn't match what I saw. Ortiz swore quietly behind me, tapping her scanner in frustration. "The map's useless," she said. "We're inside a fold." I didn't ask what she meant. I could feel it too. The entire station was shifting around us, not moving, but rearranging. Like we were insects crawling through a body that had decided to notice us. We found the first survivor in the communications room, Dr. Foster. She sat crouched beneath a console, eyes wide and unblinking, whispering the same phrase over and over. "It rises by descending, always patient, always watching." Kessler approached and sedated her without hesitation. "Protocol," he muttered, though his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the dose. The next two we found were worse. In the lab, two researchers stood in front of a whiteboard scrawled with equations, nonsense strings of symbols looping back on themselves like Mobius strips. They turned in perfect unison when we entered. "The depths have teeth," one said, "but no mouth to feed," the other finished. They smiled at the same time, the kind of smile you never want to see in a mirror. Diaz moved in fast, injecting, both before they could say anything else. The further we went, the more impossible it became. At one point, the ceiling of the corridor held water like a reverse ocean, rippling above us while the floor remained dry. No glass, no containment. Just water suspended above like it didn't care about gravity anymore. Ortiz stared up at it, whispering numbers under her breath. "This isn't just spatial warping," she said. "Something's rewriting local physics. The laws don't apply here." Ahead, the hallway narrowed, bent at a nauseating curve, and opened into what had once been the main research chamber. What it had become was something else entirely. The equipment was half melted into the walls. Screens blinked static that resolved into abstract patterns before collapsing again. A central dais, which had once housed the station's server, now held something new. Black, perfect, familiar. A cube, twice the size of the one from the ruins. It pulsed, not with light but with presence. Like a heartbeat you could feel in your teeth. All around it the walls were slick with condensation, though the room was freezing. I realized with sudden clarity that this wasn't a breach, it was a merging, and the station hadn't been broken, it had been claimed. The second cube didn't sit in the center of the room, it anchored it. Everything else bent around it, light, heat, structure, even thought. I felt it the moment I stepped into the chamber, like pressure behind my eyes, a subtle tuning fork vibrating inside my skull. Ortiz approached it first, drawn not by curiosity but compulsion. She knelt beside the containment platform and ran her scanner along its surface, but the display glitched out the moment the beam touched the stone. She muttered under her breath, fingers twitching on the console. "It's not reflecting anything. It's absorbing the scans." The data stream flashed, then died, and Ortiz leaned back, visibly shaken. No mass, no thermal reading, no radiation, it's just there. Captain Rodas issued the order to begin data extraction. Ortiz moved to interface with the station's mainframe, what was left of it, and I was instructed to sweep the adjacent chambers for additional survivors. I moved alone, the others busy cataloging the impossible. The corridors twisted in on themselves, but I followed a rhythm, a pattern I couldn't explain but somehow understood, like the cube had whispered it to me. I found the last chamber tucked away in a space that shouldn't have existed. No walls, no corners, just the suggestion of a room. That's where I found Dr. Hoffman. He sat at a desk, posture perfect, face illuminated by a single emergency light, blinking red every 3 seconds. He didn't look surprised to see me. He didn't look entirely human. His skin had taken on a translucent quality, slick, waxy, pulled too tightly over his bones. Veins glowed faintly beneath the surface. His movements were fluid, unnatural, like something underwater mimicking a man. And yet, his voice was calm, familiar. "You're from Abyssal Recovery," he said. "You're here for the cube, not for us." I moved closer, cautiously. "We're here for everyone," I said, unsure even as I said it. Hoffman laughed softly. "No need to lie. The cube is changing, growing, communicating. You can feel it, can't you?" He tilted his head. "You've already begun to change." On the desk beside him was a journal, bound in cracked leather, stained and swollen with moisture. Its pages were covered in handwritten notes, figures, symbols. I flipped through while Hoffman spoke, his voice drifting somewhere between reverence and detachment. The first entries were clinical, standard logs on pressure readings, vent activity, mineral analysis. But as the pages progressed, the script became erratic, not just in content but in form. The handwriting slanted sideways, curved into loops, sometimes spiraling into the margins. Symbols that didn't belong in any language I knew began to appear, etchings that seemed to shift when I looked too long. "The water has memory," one page read. "It doesn't forget, it waits." And now it's speaking again. Another read. "The cube doesn't want to be studied. It wants to be understood." A third. "We are not discovering it, we are remembering it. Something inside us already knows." Hoffman's breathing slowed as he spoke of the deep. "It's not trying to kill us," he said. "It's trying to rejoin us. We're the stray limb, the amputated thought it's been calling for eons." I didn't argue. I just reached for the journal. Rule 6 echoed in my mind. Never remove written material from compromised sites, but I was already sliding it into my equipment bag. The leather cover felt warm, damp, alive. Behind me, Hoffman stood slowly and approached, the cube through the open doorway. I wanted to stop him, to say something, but my voice faltered. As he neared the artifact, he raised his hand, and the cube pulsed. Once. The light in the room dimmed, and Hoffman whispered, "It's ready." I didn't open the journal again until we were safely back aboard the Orpheus, hours after the extraction, after the final survivor had been sedated and secured. The dive suits were stowed. The debriefing was a blur. My hands still stung from gripping metal that hummed like bone. I sat alone in my quarters, the soft blue emergency lighting casting long shadows on the walls, and pulled the journal from my gear bag like it was contraband, which, by every definition, it was. Its weight felt heavier now, like it had absorbed something from the site, or maybe from me. I opened it with deliberate care, avoiding the pages I'd already seen. There were more now, tucked in the back, written in a different hand, less coherent, less human. The ink blurred in places, the letters bleeding together into forms that made my eyes ache. Some symbols had been scrawled over and over, as if Hoffman had been trying to remember something just beyond the edge of language. That's when I found it, folded between two brittle pages, a small sheet torn from the spine and tucked away, like a secret Hoffman didn't want to lose. It wasn't dated. The writing was smaller, tighter. There was no header, no explanation, just a single phrase written in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. "What rises must descend again." Below. "It, Rule 0. I stared at those words for a long time, long enough to feel the blood drain from my face. long enough for the hum of the ship to feel like it was echoing from inside me. I flipped back through the journal. That phrase appeared again and again, buried in margins, scribbled in footnotes. Not every instance was complete, sometimes just fragments. Descend again, the changed ones. Not victims, vessels. I understood in that moment why it wasn't in the manual. Rule 0 wasn't meant to be followed. It was meant to be discovered, and once you saw it, it couldn't be unseen. I pressed my hand against the page, feeling the texture of the ink, crusted, raised like scar tissue. As my fingertips passed over it, a line from earlier came back to me. One I hadn't understood then, but which now made chilling sense. The rules were never meant to protect us. They were a filter. I closed the journal and sat back, heart pounding, ears ringing with the silence between sonar pulses. Rule 0 wasn't a warning, it was a prophecy, and I had already started fulfilling it. 3 days after the Depth 7 incident, seismic monitors across the Pacific lit up with a pattern too precise to be natural. A new trench had formed, fast, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the seabed like a wound opened by intent rather than force. The data made no sense. Tectonic movement that rapid should have caused tsunamis, structural collapse, death. But there was none of that. Just a silent gash in the Earth's crust, and in its shadow a pressure anomaly that exceeded the Mariana Trench. We received orders before dawn. Deploy the Orpheus fully crewed. Retrieve whatever we could. I wasn't asked if I was ready. I wasn't even briefed. Captain Rhodes simply handed me a suit, his expression unreadable, and said, "It's time." The dive began at 300 hours. The Orpheus moaned under the strain as we dropped, deeper, faster, further than we ever had. The adaptive hull flexed and shimmered with a sound like bones settling in ancient Earth. At 20,000 feet, the outside pressure had doubled anything we'd encountered before. The ocean around us wasn't water anymore. It was weight. It crushed. Sound into silence, bent light into strange geometries. I sat in the control chamber beside Ortiz, watching the readouts spiral into unknown ranges. "We shouldn't be here," she muttered, half to herself. "This isn't descent anymore, this is crossing." The trench appeared on sonar first, perfectly symmetrical, like a machine had carved it. No jagged stone, no uneven ridges, just smooth walls descending into darkness. At 28,000 feet, the lights began to fail, one by one, not flickering, just extinguished, as if the abyss had reached up and pinched them out. We activated external floodlights, but they cut through only a few feet of water before vanishing into black. Then, at 30,000 feet, we saw it, the structure at the bottom. Round, massive, at least 300 feet across. It resembled a hatch or gateway, covered in radial patterns and mechanical protrusions that seemed both ancient and untouched. The material was alien in sheen and impossible in age. No sediment, no corrosion, like it had been waiting for us. Ortiz whispered, "That's not built, that's grown." The silence in the chamber deepened. Even the ship's systems seemed reluctant to hum. Sensors spiked and died. Radiation levels surged, then normalized. Electromagnetic pulses disrupted our instruments for 6 seconds at a time, during which the lights would dim just slightly, barely noticeable unless you were already afraid. Rhodes ordered a preliminary survey. Fisher, one of our new divers, volunteered. Nakamura would observe remotely. I watched Fisher suit up, his breathing too fast, his fingers twitching, his helmet locking with a final hiss that felt like sealing a coffin. The dive chamber cycled. The external hatch opened. Fisher dropped like a stone. The external cams tracked his descent as he floated toward the surface of the hatch, its edges pulsating faintly. We didn't notice the symbols at first. They were dark, almost invisible. But as Fisher approached, they glowed, faintly at first, then brighter. A steady bioluminescent pulse that moved in sequence, forming patterns. The hatch was waking. Up then Fisher spoke. "It's beautiful," he said. "Can you see it? They're talking to us." His voice was distant, dreamlike. Rhodus snapped, "Maintain protocol. Do not touch the structure." But Fisher wasn't listening. His hand extended. The moment his glove touched the glowing surface, his body convulsed. The suit bulged, sensors spiked. His vitals went haywire. His voice rose in a scream that bent into something inhuman. Ortiz gasped. "It's changing him, now! Faster than Davis, faster than any of them!" The structure beneath him began to rotate, slowly, ponderously, revealing intricate mechanisms beneath its surface. Patterns not meant for human comprehension. Rhodus shouted, "Emergency ascent now!" But it was too late. The trench had opened, and we were no longer alone. Fisher's scream fractured into static, but the feed kept running. His body thrashed, no longer fighting but mutating, limbs elongating beneath the suit, bones bending into unnatural geometry, joints splitting and reforming. His helmet cracked from within, revealing a face that was no longer a face. Skin stretched thin, almost translucent, his eyes gone utterly black. "Help me," he croaked through a voice modulator no longer tuned to a human throat. "It's showing me everything." The words chilled the room. They weren't panicked, they were reverent. Director Lawson's voice came down from command. "Initiate protocol sundering." A code phrase, a final act. Rhodus froze, staring at the monitor like he was seeing something older than time itself. "He's still conscious," he whispered. "Still learning." Nakamura grabbed his arm. "We knew this might happen," she hissed. "You helped build the protocols for this exact moment." Rhodus looked at her then, not with anger, but pity. That was before I remembered who I was. The submarine lurched violently to the side. Warning sirens blared as pressure surged around us. Something massive was moving outside the Orpheus, stirring the waters in coordinated motion. The sonar registered shapes, shifting densities. None of them identifiable, all of them enormous. Ortiz screamed from engineering. "Pressure spikes past containment. Something's rising from the trench." We scrambled. Power surged and failed in waves. Hallways blinked in and out as emergency lights flickered like dying stars. I ran to the containment chamber just in time to see Fisher collapse behind the glass, or what was left of him. His suit had fused with his skin. Webbing stretched between his fingers. His chest rose and fell with a rhythm that didn't match any biological norm. He looked at me, really looked, and I knew he wasn't asking for help. He was waiting, and somehow so was I. Behind me, Ortiz shouted for core override authorization. "We have to collapse the trench. Detonate the drive, now." Nakamura spun around, voice calm but chilling. "You'll just trigger it faster. You don't understand. It's not trying to escape. It's opening a door." Rhodus raised his weapon, aiming at her. "You've been compromised." "We all have," she said simply, pulling up her sleeve. Her skin was patterned, veined with bioluminescent ridges beneath the surface. This was never containment. It was communion. Then she looked at me. "Tell him you've changed too." And I had. I could feel it in my breath, in the way my lungs no longer ached at depth, in my skin, which now rippled when I touched. Water. In my thoughts, which no longer came one at a time but layered, branching. I had felt the cube respond to me. I had seen reflections that moved before I did. And most damning of all, I had broken the rules. I had touched forbidden texts, crossed the 6-foot line, stared into depths I was never meant to see. I had begun to enjoy the darkness. It no longer frightened me. It felt like home. Another impact rocked the Orpheus. Bulkheads gave way. Alarms screamed and the hull groaned like it was begging to die. Rhodes turned to me with wild eyes. "You've been compromised," he said. "When did it start?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. His gaze fell on the bag slung over my shoulder, the one with Hoffman's journal, the one I should have left behind. Rule 6, my first violation. Then came Rule 1, when I closed the gap to save Davis. Rule 7, the enjoyment, the silence, the stillness in the black. I wasn't sure I could stop the change. I wasn't sure I wanted to. He handed me the detonator. "If you're still human, make the call." Another jolt. Outside, the abyss shifted, a shadow peeling upward from the trench wall, massive, patient, intelligent. I saw the symbols on the hatch align. A pulse of blue light surged through the command deck, and deep in my chest, something answered. The command deck was burning, not with fire but with data. Screens flickering with incomprehensible patterns, warning lights strobing in sync with something pulsing from the trench below. The detonator in my hand grew heavy, not physically, but morally, like it carried the weight of more than one world. Captain Rhodes stood across from me, chest heaving, face tight with desperation, but not fear. He had stopped being afraid years ago. "It has to end here," he said, voice barely audible over the sirens and the creaking hull. "This isn't evolution, it's consumption." Behind him, Nakamura stood in the shattered threshold of the medbay, spine brace flexing like an exoskeleton, skin glowing faintly beneath the flicker of emergency lights. Her voice cut through the chaos with terrible calm. "You're wrong, Rhodes. It's not taking us. We're returning to what we were meant to be." I stood between them. One man, two futures. I wanted to say something that would cut through the madness, something human. But what came out was silence, thick and drowning. "You saw the journal," Nakamura said, taking a step forward. "You saw Rule 0. What rises must descend again. You know what it means." She turned her eyes. To me, eyes that were no longer just hers, that held something deeper behind them. The rules were never written to protect us. They were filters, thresholds, to find the ones who could break them and survive. Rhodes turned, weapon in hand, aiming at her chest. "And what happens when enough of us descend? What happens when we open the door completely?" He didn't wait for an answer. "You weren't there in 78. I saw it. I saw what comes through." The barrel of the weapon trembled, not from hesitation, but from the sheer pressure inside the Orpheus, from the fact that the laws of physics were no longer obeying us. They were listening to something else. Ortiz's voice crackled over the comms. "Pressure's at critical levels. We either go up now or we never come back." But even her voice was different, quieter, more contemplative. The crew had changed, some slowly, some suddenly. The Orpheus was no longer a ship. It was a cradle, and we were becoming. Rhodes stepped closer. "You don't understand. The deep doesn't give. It converts. You think you're evolving, but you're just being overwritten. And you think you've resisted," Nakamura countered, "but you never stopped changing. The cube chose you long before you wrote your first rule." Her words weren't accusations. They were truths spoken without cruelty. "Why do you think you remember now?" "Because it's time. We're nearing alignment. And he," she pointed. "To me, he's the final piece." I looked at them both and realized the decision had never been theirs. It wasn't even mine. It had been made the moment I survived Mariana. The cube, the rules, the transformations, they weren't tests. They were awakenings. "You always said the rules were written in blood," I said quietly, turning to Rhodes's. "But maybe they were written in something older than that, something that remembers." He didn't lower his weapon, but I could see it in his eyes. Exhaustion, regret, a sliver of acceptance. "We're out of time," Ortiz said. "Pressure alarms just went dead." The systems aren't failing. They're surrendering. Nakamura stepped beside me now, not in triumph, but solidarity. You can still choose, she whispered, but choose what you've become, not what you were. And for the first time I understood. It wasn't a war between science and monstrosity, or protocol and madness. It was a return to a depth that was never just physical, but genetic, existential, cosmic. And the choice wasn't survival, it was recognition. I stood in the heart of the Orpheus, drenched in alarms, shadows, and silence, the detonator still cradled in my hand, like a relic from another life. Around me, the world had thinned, blurred at the edges, stretched between two realities, neither of which I could fully call home. My thoughts came in waves now, layered and recursive, like echoes in water. Memories floated to the surface unbidden. The weightless calm of the Mariana Trench, the faint flicker of a reflection that had smiled before I did, the impossible calm I'd felt in complete darkness. I remembered how the rules had once anchored me, how they'd felt like armor. Now they felt like anchors, designed not to protect but to hold us in place, to keep us from becoming something we already were. I stared down at my hands. They trembled, but not with fear. Something beneath. The skin stirred, a ripple, a pulse. I remembered Fisher's last words. It's showing me everything. Was that what this was? Revelation or erasure? I no longer knew. Rhodes's voice echoed faintly behind me, but I couldn't make out the words anymore. It wasn't distance, it was dissonance. He spoke in resistance, in survival, in desperate preservation of identity. But my identity had already shifted. I'd watched myself fade one layer at a time. The man who'd joined the Navy to escape the landlocked terror of silence no longer existed. The man who had surfaced from Mariana, changed but unaware, was already a ghost. What stood here now was a bridge. Part flesh, part pressure, part purpose. But purpose toward what? That was the war tearing at my ribs. Somewhere in me, the human self, the voice raised on orders and consequences, still shouted to activate the core detonation, to bury this thing before it reached the surface, before it swallowed the species whole. But something deeper, older, quieter offered no fear, just understanding. The abyss didn't want destruction. It wanted return, reunion, reformation. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling my heartbeat no longer match the rhythm of the ship. It beat in time with something else now, with the trench, with the cube, with them. And as I stared at the detonator, my thumb hovering over the trigger, I didn't see a weapon. I saw a door, and I wasn't sure if I was meant to close it or step through. The silence before the final decision was not empty. It was total. Not the absence of sound, but the compression of it. The way deep water flattens everything until even thought feels like a whisper. I stood on the command platform of the Orpheus, pressure alarms long since dead, the detonator in one hand, the journal in the other. Around me, systems flickered with no rhythm, panels bled static, and the hull groaned with slow, knowing pain. The trench outside was no longer passive. It breathed. The blue-green symbols carved into the immense circular hatch pulsed like veins, and I could feel their rhythm matching my own. It wasn't madness, it was alignment. Behind me, Rhodes stood motionless, weapon lowered, his features slack, not from fear, but from surrender. And Nakamura was already gone in all but body, her transformation nearly complete, the subtle glow beneath her skin casting shadows that danced without a source. I looked at them both, not as enemies or allies, but as endpoints, different equations leading to the same unknown sum. The detonator weighed nothing now. Its purpose was obsolete. its binary promise of salvation or destruction dwarfed by what waited outside. The old instincts clawed at my spine: detonate, prevent breach, preserve humanity. But they were echoes. What stirred now was deeper, truer. I remembered Rule Zero: what rises must descend again. I finally understood. We had always thought the rules were to protect us from the abyss. But they were meant to guide us toward it. Those of us who could change, who were always meant to change. We weren't resisting a threat. We were hearing a call for reunion. My body had already begun answering. Skin adapted. Vision sharpened. Breath slowed. Even now the faint hum of the cube resonated inside my bones, not as a warning, but as welcome. I looked through the viewport one last time. The abyss had eyes. It had always been watching, waiting for the ones who could return without breaking. Vessels, not victims. Translators, not trespassers. I lowered the detonator. No alarm sounded. No one stopped me. In that moment, there was no resistance. Only gravity. Only pull. I reached for the control console and rerouted the Orpheus's ascent protocol into standby. We wouldn't be surfacing. Not yet. Not until we finished becoming. Rhodes didn't move. Nakamura smiled faintly, almost mournfully, as if she'd known all along I would make this choice. As the external hatch began to cycle, pressure equalizing. With something far deeper than physics could calculate, I took my final breath as something approximating human and stepped into the dark. The new vessel wasn't called Orpheus. That name had been decommissioned, scrubbed from records with the cold efficiency of bureaucratic denial. The new craft, sleeker, larger, with reinforced systems and AI-assisted navigation, was christened Eurydice, a name with no clear linguistic origin, just enough ambiguity to keep questions at bay. The facility above had changed too. Once a converted oil platform, it now resembled something grown rather than built, an asymmetrical tower of composite alloys and pressure-tempered glass, rising from the sea like a coral spire. Director Lawson stood at the head of the new assembly, her hair no longer pinned tightly, her eyes somehow softer and emptier at once. "You've been selected for your adaptability," she told the 12 recruits assembled on the dock, each of them clad in grey uniforms with fresh shoulder tabs. "This mission is unlike any other. What lies below is not merely unknown, it is in motion." Behind her, hollow displays flickered with data, abstract sonar shapes, pulsing pressure charts, the barest edge of geometry traced in deep-sea scans. They weren't given full details, not yet. Only the most basic rules, newly revised, the original 7, now 8, etched into titanium-plated manuals distributed in sealed cases. At the bottom of each was a redacted reference to a final clause. Rule 0. See your commanding officer. No one asked what that meant, not aloud. But several glanced at the empty berth in the back, where a 13th file had been prepared. No face, no name. Just a notation. Active, unretrieved. Lawson didn't elaborate. They boarded the Eurydice in silence, engineers checking seals, scientists calibrating equipment, security operatives whispering about depth thresholds and neurological screening. Protocols. The vessel groaned as the airlock sealed, not mechanically, but like something waking up. No one mentioned the similarities to Orpheus. They weren't supposed to, but many of them had read the unofficial files, the rumors, the fragments of audio logs salvaged from a wreck that had supposedly imploded at impossible depth. And some had seen more, dreams they couldn't explain, reflections that moved just a breath too early, a comfort in silence that hadn't existed before. They were here for recovery, retrieval, study, but one of them, though they didn't yet know which, was here for something else entirely. Far below, beyond sonar and reason, I felt the pressure shift. I felt the Eurydice's hull kiss the edge of the new trench. I heard the hum of its systems, no longer foreign to me but familiar, like a voice I had once spoken with before, forgetting how. I reached out, not physically, but through the dark, medium between us, the language of compression and stillness. They didn't know it yet, but I was waiting, watching, listening. The sea was ready to receive them, and I was ready to welcome them home. I no longer remember the taste of surface. Data. Not the salt-laced breeze from the Washington coast, not the filtered oxygen of the Orpheus, not even the cold steel sterility of emergency tanks in pressure chambers. Those sensations belong to someone else now, someone with skin that didn't ripple, whose blood didn't pulse to the rhythm of tectonic breathing. The man I was, Lieutenant Jackson Thompson, died long before the trench opened. Perhaps he died in the Mariana, in that moment of impossible survival. Or perhaps he was always dying, cracking, sinking, reforming in slow, imperceptible layers, until what remained no longer resembled a man at all. Down here there is no time, no calendar, no clocks, only rhythms, the pulse of the Earth's crust shifting in its sleep, the slow heartbeat of ancient mechanisms buried beneath millennia of silence, and the breathing, yes, there is breathing, in the dark. And now I breathe with it. The cube taught me how. It wasn't a machine or an artifact. It was a question etched into matter itself, a test written in pressure and isolation, and the human desire to understand what was never ours, to name. And I answered it. I broke the rules, not recklessly but inevitably. And each broken rule opened me like a door. I thought once that I would become something monstrous, something lost. But the truth is colder than that, and more beautiful. I didn't lose myself. I expanded. My skin no longer ends at my bones. I feel the trench walls like nerves, the weight of passing currents like whispers brushing past my consciousness. I know now that the deep was never hostile. It was patient, it remembered. It waited for someone who could listen, not with ears but with cells. And I listened. I still do. I am not alone down here. There are others, some older than thought, some newer than breath. Some were born here, others like me were remade. And we are not broken, we are not possessed. We are not corrupted, we are aligned. They send new vessels now. Sleek ships with fresh names, new recruits with steady hands and skeptical eyes. They come armed with rules, 9 of them now. Protocols revised, words wrapped around fear like gauze around a wound that refuses to heal. But the truth still waits in the spaces between, in the gaps between heartbeats, in the mirrored reflections that linger a moment too long, in the quiet joy they'll feel the first time the light dies, and the darkness cradles them instead of threatening them. One of them will descend. One always does. They will hear me. Maybe in sonar static, maybe in a reflection, maybe in a dream. And they will understand what the rules could never say aloud, that this place is not a prison or a hell. It is an inheritance. And those who can descend and remain are not breaking, they are returning. There is one last rule. It was never written. It cannot be spoken. It is only known in the marrow of those who survive the weight of the deep and remain themselves, even as themselves dissolve. It is the rule that comes after all others. To stay is to become, and I have stayed. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't keep the fear to yourself. Leave a comment, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who dares to listen in the dark. We release terrifying true stories every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. This is High Scare Stories, where nightmares don't end when the video does. Until next time, stay safe and stay scared.